For many, death is a taboo topic, but it used to be a much more integrated part of our daily lives. This week on the show, we're kicking off our Halloween month by looking death in the face and asking, when did we stop hanging out? Hey, I'm Laurel Bristow, and this is Health Wanted. Each week, we cover your need-to-know public health topics and break down the science behind them in our pursuit of better health. Ladies and ladies, boys and ghouls, spectral bodies and creatures from beyond the grave, it's finally October. Last year, I may have been fine with simply one episode on the Halloween theme, but this year, I have a thirst for blood. More. So now, the entire month of October is dedicated to the eerier subject matter in health, or rather, unwellness. To kick it off, we're starting with the great beyond. Not so much what's over on the other side. I like to imagine everyone just ends up in their idea of heaven, be it a place that they are familiar with or one of their inventing. Mine would probably be a lake with a dock, an endless supply of National Geographics, and a friend with endless patience for listening to me summarize the article I just read. But no, today we are talking about what we do with our empty vessels on the way to the other side. The first step to getting there is, of course, to die. Now, as you know, on this show, we like to back things up with numbers. So a stat that may shock you to learn is that about 94% of people who have ever lived have died. Even crazier to imagine is that currently, there is a 100% chance that those remaining living people will also, one day, be dead. Statistics are amazing. I know I've always had a somewhat strange relationship with death. In high school, my best friend and I used to drive to Fenton's Creamery and get ice cream cones and then eat them in Mountain View Cemetery while we visited our favorite headstone for Captain Eric Holliday. My life's goal was to own a piece of memento mori jewelry that contained the woven hair from a deceased human I've never met. I actually ended up owning two pieces, one of which was a ring I lost on the Beltline a few weeks ago, so if you find a small ring with a window of finely braided hair, please let me know. I am extremely sad I lost it. I even have a tattoo of the theoretical euthanasia coaster on my arm. It's a concept for a roller coaster that could be used for terminally ill people to take control of their own deaths by taking one last ride that would humanely and peacefully end their lives. But I have found throughout my life that these feelings of fondness for reminders of death are somewhat of an outlier. For most people, the topic of death is not exactly a popular one. Being faced with any mortality can, understandably, cause some anxiety about facing one's own. But it didn't always used to be this way. Death used to be a more intimate experience in a person's life, for good or bad. Prior to the mid-20th century, people tended to be buried in the churchyard or on their own land if they were lucky enough to be landowners, which worked well prior to industrialization and increasing populations. A tiny churchyard can fill up quickly, requiring layers upon layers of flimsy pine coffins to fit all who need to rest there. As my dad would say, they were so popular, people were dying to get in. Heavy rains or floods had a tendency to bring the dead back into the realm of living when bodies would break free from their containers. During times of increased mortality due to outbreaks of diseases like cholera and yellow fever, these small, centralized plots began to be viewed as epicenters for disease. The Holy Innocents Cemetery had been building up its population in Paris for over 500 years, growing right along with the city that was being built all around it. Until, in the spring of 1780, residents of a street bordering the cemetery began to complain of respiratory issues, vomiting, and delirium. An investigation revealed that gases from the decomposing bodies of their underground neighbors had broken through the cellars of at least 3 homes and made it up to the ground floor. The fact that this wasn't immediately apparent without an investigation gives you a good sense of Paris's baseline smell at the time. A smell that inspired the popularity of the theory of miasma, a belief that illness was caused by malodorous air. Similarly, an 1822 outbreak of yellow fever in New York was thought to be caused by the noxious odors coming from the Trinity Cemetery. It would take another 60 years for someone to make the case that the disease was spread by mosquitoes, and even then he would be laughed at for such a ridiculous idea. Needless to say, having the stink of the dead was therefore unacceptable in a society that cared about health. So, the rural cemetery, which were large plots of land dedicated to the dead just outside city limits, was born. Well, in America at least. The Holy Innocents Cemetery incident actually prompted the dead to get a bit closer to the living, right underneath, actually. The French government began exhuming bodies from that cemetery and moving them into the large underground mine systems that had come from digging out the limestone that built all the wonderful Parisian architecture, thus creating the catacombs, where the bones of 6 million French now rest. If you are not lucky enough to live in a city built on an army of the dead, these rural cemeteries would be the kind of cemeteries you think of when you think of Halloween. The artful tombstones of weeping angels, the giant oaks and manicured shrubs, final resting places that look more like just that, resting places. Their family mausoleums, like small homes or plots with headboard-like gravestones marking husbands laid next to wives. And they, importantly, had space saved for new residents. Space that was certainly needed during the American Civil War. That is, if you were lucky enough to die close to home. Because for the first time, large numbers of people were dying far away from their homes. Most bodies were simply left where they fell. Rich Northerners could pay to have loved ones transported home, but without any preservation, it could be a messy ordeal. It was a new problem that was solved by the Frenchman Jean Ganal, who wrote about his take on the Egyptian process of preserving bodies by replacing the blood or other fluids with more stable substances. And if there's one thing that Americans love, it's an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a new business venture. And field embalmers began following camps around the battlefields of the South. The practice became so popular, yet so haphazard, the War Department was forced to issue an order limiting field embalming to only licensed providers. And so began the modern funeral industry, and with it, a greater separation between the living and dead. Where families used to be in charge of preparing their loved one's body, holding the funeral at home, and burying the deceased in a church plot or backyard cemetery, these tasks were now being outsourced to professionals. The lack of physical proximity to the dead seems to inspire a trend to try and close the emotional distance. Spiritualism, a religious movement that viewed death not as the end of life but simply a different phase, gained popularity for its use of seances to commune with the dead. It was like the 19th century's version of the celebrity Kabbalah boom that happened in the early 2000s. Seances to call people from beyond the veil involved all number of theatrics, from shaking tables to flickering lights to the expulsion of ectoplasm, an otherworldly substance that was supposed to be the physical manifestation of the spirits in the room with you and proof that your seance guide could cross the void, but that looked a lot like cheesecloth that someone had swallowed and regurgitated for show. Ectoplasm was a popular enough concept that it grabbed the attention of some rather impressive scientific publications. Scientific American ran a series across 4 issues in 1924 investigating spiritual mediums who claimed they could produce the substance. A 1921 edition of Popular Science described the substance as curiously like human skin in cellular structure. And from 1920 to 1925, the New York Times made no less than a dozen references to ectoplasm in its writings. Now the only references are to the Ghostbusters promotional beverage, the Ecto Cooler, that ran from 1989 to 2016. While it's easy to look back on the trend of spiritualism and seances and ectoplasm and laugh at the naivete of Americans back then, it's important to remember the popularity was born out of the longing that so many families had to get at least one last chance at talking to their sons who had died on the front lines of World War I. And it makes me wonder if our increasing distance from death is what causes us to have a hard time with dying. The trend of rural cemeteries began before cities had parks or museums or botanical gardens, so the cemeteries became the default dedicated green space. Before they became synonymous with being the hangout for your local goth kids, they were a place for the masses to congregate and enjoy nature. A far cry from today's memorial parks, the new name that has replaced cemetery for modern burial grounds. These places often look more like vast lawns, with grids of neatly organized graves, making it easy for the lawnmower to pass, with modest markers denoting names and dates. Places that feel more like a space for the memory of someone rather than their lasting physical location. But it seems the tides may be turning, and people are beginning to embrace alternative ways to be laid to rest, outside of the traditional burial. Cremation had already been gaining popularity over the years. The National Funeral Directors Association predicted that the cremation rate would be over 61% in 2024, compared to just 33% for burials. But everything old is new again, and 68% of people surveyed in their consumer awareness report said they would be interested in the possibility of a green burial, which people pre-Civil War would just describe as a burial. The practice removes much of the process that separates and sterilizes death. Green burial is a general term that covers a number of post-death care practices that are non-toxic and sustainable. There's no formaldehyde embalming allowed, which means that people don't need to be buried with plastic or cement vault liners to keep the toxic chemicals from leaking into the ground. Even with these liners, the process of embalming dumps an estimated 800,000 gallons of carcinogenic formaldehyde into the environment per year in North America, one of the few places globally to still use the practice. Instead, people are buried in a simple shroud or casket directly into the earth to decompose and return their nutrients to nature, something spreading cremated remains cannot do as they've been sterilized by the high heat of the crematorium. In green cemeteries, the graves are marked with a simple flat headstone that blends into the landscape and allows loved ones to visit while once again enjoying the surrounding nature. Another option for a more sustainable practice is human composting. Legal in 14 states, the practice involves placing a body in a container filled with materials like wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. Microbes go to work breaking down the body, which creates heat. In Washington state, the heat must remain at or above 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days to kill off any harmful pathogens. The end product comes in about 8 to 12 weeks. The body has been turned into soil that can be shipped back to the family or donated to be spread in conservation lands. The process does not use fossil fuels or emit high levels of CO2 that traditional cremation would. If you're a claustrophobic sort looking for a less burial-like option, it is legal to have your whole body cast out to sea, assuming you are at least 3 nautical miles from shore and being dumped into water no less than 600 feet deep. Though the EPA does recommend that you be put in either a metal coffin, like the Navy uses, or have a heavy chain tied around the uncasketed body to help the sinking process. Oh, and be sure to check your local laws about transporting a body to anywhere other than a cemetery. If you're lucky enough to be a resident of Crestone, Colorado, you have the option for the Viking funeral of your dreams. It's the only city in America that has a public outdoor funeral pyre. While public cremations have been commonplace in parts of India for centuries, Americans tend to be a bit more squeamish about the idea of setting a loved one on fire. Part of the appeal of traditional cremation is that it's a quick and easy way to turn the body into a memorial behind closed doors. Families and friends in this town are the ones to usher the body from its home viewing to its fiery release, once again involving those closest to the deceased in the act of releasing them into the beyond. It's actually the exact method that I plan to use for Axolotl Rose's funeral in a few weeks. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of funerary practices in America, but as we, as a country, continue to shift our views about the ways we want to transition into eternity, we should all remember the wise words of the poet Keanu Reeves when asked about what happens when we die.
I know that the ones who love us will miss us.
And perhaps, rather than avoiding the scary thought of our own eventual demise, turn towards the opportunity to plan a transition that will allow the ones who love us the greatest sense of peace. For Health Wanted, I'm Laurel Bristow.